Hi, this is Paul Salem of the Middle East Institute. I'm very happy to have with me today Dr. Eric Trager of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy for this edition of MEI's VantagePoint, our webcast series. And Eric is with us today to talk about his new book, Arab Fall, How the Muslim Brotherhood Won and Lost Egypt in 891 Days. A book that came out of Georgetown University Press at the end of 2016, covers the dynamics of what happened in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood from 2011 up to the present day. Eric, welcome to the Middle East Institute. Eric, I should say, is the Esther Wagner Fellow at the Washington Institute, writes prolifically on Egypt and Egyptian politics. He's written in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, Atlantic, and many other publications. He studied at a number of places, Harvard University, BA, and then American University of Cairo, and was a Fulbright scholar there in Cairo from 2006 to 2007, and got his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Eric, thanks for coming, and let's get straight to it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for making the time in this new year. Give us the arc of what the book covers in terms of where was the Muslim Brotherhood on the eve of sort of the surprising events of the Arab Spring that few people expected, including them. Where were they at that point? And what were the main sort of turning points in the saga that led to their rise and then their demise?
Well, I think it's really important to start by understanding what the Brotherhood's goal is. The Brotherhood, remember, emerged in the 1920s and 1928 in this intellectual context in which many Muslim thinkers were asking themselves, why has Islam fallen behind the West? Why has Islam, which during the early centuries of its revelation controlled much of the known world, was on the cutting edge of science and technology, why in the late 1800s, early 1900s, why had it fallen behind both in terms of Western imperialism, but also in terms of Western cultural and scientific advancement? And one of the answers that came out during this period from a group known as the Modernists was that Islam had calcified in terms of the way it was taught and the way it was practiced, and to resist the West, you needed to revive Islam. And what the Muslim Brotherhood brought to this way of thinking was this idea that to revive Islam, you had to create a specific kind of organization that could recruit individuals who would then spread this message of Islam that the Brotherhood created in the society. Once it achieved sufficient societal support, it would then pursue political power. And once this process unfolded in multiple countries, all of these Brotherhood groups in power in multiple countries would unify and establish a global Islamic state.
Like a Communist International for an Islamist, kind of a Leninist plan for
many people
party.
have drawn that analogy, and there's sort of a question as to whether Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Brotherhood, was inspired by that. I don't really address that specifically.
I say that somewhat
sure. No, but actually there is a definite historic parallel that's worth noting. Anyway, by the time of the 2011 uprising in Egypt...
Yeah, because I know there's a lot of history throughout the 20th century, but let's go straight to
there.
End of 2010.
By the end of 2010, the Brotherhood had, for the previous really 25, 30 years, enjoyed a degree of freedom in Egypt. Obviously, it waxed and waned, but they had developed the organization such that there were cells of Muslim brothers across the nation. There was a nationwide hierarchy. They believed that they were in the process of Islamizing the society, and they then believed that at a certain point in history, they would pursue political power, but they weren't there yet.
Would you say during the Mubarak years, they sort of were the loyal opposition, a kind of role that they were allowed to play?
I think
would you describe it differently?
That's an element of what they were doing, obviously, in terms of participating in the Mubarak regime's parliament, at times participating in other types of opposition settings. But for the most part, the Brotherhood was really focused on societal outreach. It was really focused on what it called Islamizing the society, preparing it for that moment in the future, it didn't know when, that it would pursue power. And what happened after the January 25th, 2011 uprising, the so-called Arab Spring, is the Brotherhood saw a political environment that for the first time was very open, and it was the best organized group in the country, and it therefore believed that its moment had come to transition from Islamizing the society to Islamizing the state.
Well, during that period, what were the internal maybe debates within the Muslim Brotherhood? Because initially, in the early months of the revolution, when they joined and so on with other groups, they promised, as it were, to restrain themselves and just maintain a minority or achieve a minority in parliament, not run a presidential candidate. But they ended up sort of doing something else, which was, running a presidency.
Sure.
Was that a big debate within the leadership?
It was a big debate within the leadership. Well, first of all, that debate even precedes the uprising itself, of course. You have to remember that in the 2000s, there's this debate within the Brotherhood between the Qutbists, the hardliners, people like Mohammed Morsi, people like Khayrat al-Shatter, who really believe that the Brotherhood should be an insular organization focused on building itself and winning over the society, that should remain pure to its message, and that there would be a point in the future in which, yes, it would pursue power. There were others like Abdulrahman al-Fattu, Assam al-Aryan, people that were known as the Dawa wala Kuda faction, preachers not judges, who wanted the Brotherhood to participate more with other political movements, other opposition factions, and they weren't so concerned about ideological purity. They thought that the Brotherhood should be more political now. After the revolution, you had similar types of debates about whether the Brotherhood should pursue power in its own right or whether it should do it as part of a broader coalition. And the key point here is, during this period, there were many analysts in the West who said, the Brotherhood is, an internally fractious organization. There are all these debates. And it might fall apart in this more open environment. What ultimately happened, though, was not that at all. What ultimately happened is that while these debates played out, once the Brotherhood took a decision to run for a majority of parliamentary seats, to run for presidential, to run for the presidency, to nominate a presidential candidate, all of these debates were resolved. At the end of the day, this was an organization of deeply committed people.
They went for it.
Yes, who followed in lockstep what their leaders ultimately decided, even if those decisions were very close. For example, the decision to run a presidential candidate in 2012 was narrowly passed in the Brotherhood's Shura Council by a 56-52 vote. But once that decision was taken, the overwhelming majority of Muslim brothers quickly mobilized for that presidential candidate.
You have a chapter in the book called Power Not Policy, that once in government, and this was a remark of many Egyptians at the time, they didn't seem sort of particularly prepared for governing itself, more interested in being in power. How do you sort of flesh that out in terms of the opportunity that they had for governance, and whether they were prepared or not for that?
Well, the Brotherhood, at the end of the day, I argue in the book, is primarily about pursuing power. Its view is that, first of all, it defines Islam as an all-encompassing concept meant to control every aspect of life. But anyone who studies Islam knows that Islam is a religion, a faith practiced by over 1 billion people across the world. There is no one Islam. There are many debates within Islam. So what did that really mean? What it meant for the Brotherhood is whatever it said was Islam is Islam, and it typically treated dissenters as outsiders or infidels or worse. So when it came to power, it used this argument of, we know what Islam is, we are good Muslims, we will therefore help establish an Islamic state. But once it came to power, the vacuousness of that ideology became very clear. The Brotherhood had also, by the way, drafted what was called a Renaissance project, the Nahda project. The problem was that the Nahda project was really a list of aspirations. We're going to pursue this percentage of growth. We're going to build this extent.
Goals.
Without any any type of details about how they would achieve that. So look, in a certain sense, it's not surprising. It's not surprising that an organization that reaches power shortly after an uprising, revolution, would fail in power, would not really know how to govern. That's not what's so surprising. What I think is really quite surprising is the extent to which folks in Washington actually expected a different outcome, actually expected that a group whose primary purpose was winning power, that is so exclusivist that it takes 5 to 8 years to join,
let me ask,
would govern differently.
As you say, obviously any movement that by surprise had this occasion to become, in power, maybe wasn't fully prepared, and the problems of Egypt, as President Sisi and others discover, are very challenging and difficult to manage. But to what degree were their failures their own, and to what degree were they sort of blocked and made to fail? Really what I'm getting at here is the sort of not fully visible, kind of a hidden relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and the deep state. The relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and the public, or the various sections of the public, were kind of visible. But there were phases during this revolutionary time when there seemed to be some accommodation. Even when the Muslim Brotherhood first came to power, they seemed to be a modus vivendi kind of thing. And then later in the Brotherhood's term in power, either because the Brotherhood, as you call one of your chapters, made a power grab and then elicited a deep state reaction, or something else was going on. What is the dynamic of that relationship?
Look, I think in the early months after the 2011 uprising, you had a convergence of interests between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood. Both essentially wanted to return the country to normal. The military because it saw further upheaval as threatening to the economy, but also because it feared that it might become the target of an uprising. From the Brotherhood standpoint, because it was the only well-organized political organization in the country, it saw this as its moment to rise to power, and therefore wanted to forgo street activity but have an election and win power and try to guide a constitutional process to create an Islamic state. So you had a convergence of interests. The Brotherhood then, overreached in November 2012 when Mohamed Morsi, then the president, issued a constitutional declaration putting all of his edicts above judicial scrutiny.
Let me ask about that, because that really was a pivotal moment for the beginning of sort of the rebellion against them, as well as the reaction from the deep state.
No, but just this whole deep state thing. Look, I think it's fair to note that there are moments where their interests with the state converge, their interests where they defect, but the Brotherhood lost power in large part because it rapidly alienated a vast sector of the Egyptian population. It's very hard to know, for example, and I say this in the intro, exactly what this institution or that institution or this tribal network or that tribal network was doing at any one time. It's very hard to know. These are very opaque aspects of Egypt. Even in my own research, you can get little pieces, none of which add up to anything. Just to give you an example, look, there are moments where obviously the police were working against Morsi. There are moments where the police were cracking down on anti-Morsi protests. It's hard to put together a very complete pattern. Of course, the Brotherhood, since Morsi's ouster, only focuses on those times that the police undermined him, not on the times when the police were actually helping him put down protests in front of the presidential palace. What we could say, though, is that the Brotherhood pursued power much more quickly than it was ready to govern, and once it was in power, managed to pick fights with multiple state institutions and multiple sectors of society, to the extent that many people who voted for them participated in the June 30th, 2013 uprising against them. And we have to remember, it's hard to imagine the military stepping in as it did when it did without that uprising. It's obviously a coup in the sense that the military removed a president. No question about it, and you have to understand that.
Which is sort of what happened almost with Mubarak as well. I mean, not in the same
but that event is impossible without the uprising that preceded it. And what's clear both from Brotherhood accounts as well as non-Brotherhood accounts is that even during that period, the military and others within Egypt were trying to get the Brotherhood to reach some sort of a deal that would save Morsi or save the Brotherhood or save the political process.
Well, let me ask about that period, sort of the period of the fall, or the crisis, which then was followed by a fall. So there was a 1 year when they were in government, mistakes were made, things happened, uprising, coup, and so on. During those weeks of crisis, which was really leading up to June of 2013, it was clear that the presidency and the Muslim Brotherhood were in a big crisis with a big section of the population and with a number of the power centers. What were the debates during that period, even after the June 30, even after July 3, and then the Rab'a protests, which lasted for a long while before then the army cracked down there, leading to the loss of many, many lives? What were the internal debates as to how to deal with this obvious crisis? Ghannouchi in Al-Nahda in Tunisia dealt with sort of backlash very differently than the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt did, and maybe led to very different results. What can you tell us about, the internal debates of how to deal with all of that during that hot summer?
Look, we know that there were, after Morsi's ouster, July 3rd, 2013, we know that there were some within the Brotherhood that were, negotiating with the military, in constant communication with also international actors, trying to get some sort of deal that would de-escalate the Rab'a protests, maybe restore the political process. But my research and I think a lot of the reporting would suggest that those efforts were really secondary to the broader sentiment within Rabbah, as well as, by the way, within broader Egyptian society, which is that this conflict had reached a head and it was going to be resolved one way or the other. So from the Muslim Brotherhood standpoint and those who supported the Brotherhood at Rabbah, it was what we need to do, this was the thinking, what we need to do is hold this territory, and we need to even try to expand the protests and grow them and put the military in a position where it will either have to shoot on us or not. And if we put it in that dilemma, you'll have soldiers that refuse to shoot. There will be a division in the military. It will collapse. We'll be back. And the reason they thought this, of course, was because they thought about the 2011 uprising, where there was some reports to suggest, and it's really hard to verify any of this, of course, but the theory was that the soldiers had refused to shoot on the protesters, and the order wasn't even given because of a fear that it would divide the military. Here's the problem with the Brotherhood's whole thinking. Before they would even get to putting the military in that situation, they had to first deal with the police, and the police were not so conflicted in terms of how they were going to deal with the Brotherhood. On the anti-Brotherhood side, you had, at least in my estimation, and I think this is contestable, because it's really hard to know, but I think you had a majority of the country that had very quickly and very furiously soured on the Brotherhood, and they, like the Brotherhood, saw this conflict in existential terms, and they were willing to accept a great degree of state violence to quote-unquote resolve it. And that's where the country was at. And I think here in Washington, people underestimated just how dire this crisis had very quickly become. And I think even the Brotherhood underestimated it. I think the Brotherhood underestimated the extent to which not only the state would be willing to use violence, but the extent to which the broader population, including many people that had voted for them only a year earlier, would have no problem with that. And as Americans, this is sort of a hard thing to put a finger on.
Let's jump ahead. 3 years later to where we are today. Where is the Muslim Brotherhood today? What is the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood today, and where might it be headed?
Sure. So, look, the Muslim Brotherhood...
Is it in Turkey?
The Muslim Brotherhood, as I outlined in the book, has historically been a pyramid-shaped hierarchy, right, in which a central office delivers commands to cells on the ground. The top of that hierarchy, the second tier of that hierarchy, probably a third tier, either in jail or exile. Some leaders have reorganized in Turkey, but I have not seen them since late 2014. But the last time that I've sort of interacted with Muslim brothers and reading, things that they write, they're pretty disconnected from the reality on the ground. You could see that they don't have a good sense of it. They vastly overstate their own support in Egypt. On the ground in Egypt now, Brotherhood activity has ground to a halt, at least in terms of visible activity. Because there's no command chain, it's hard to ascribe specific acts of violence to the Brotherhood as an organization. However, it's likely that many Muslim brothers have taken up arms to some extent against the state, been involved with collapsing electricity towers, acts of sabotage, things like that. But again, hard to prove because that organizational infrastructure has been so badly broken. I think the Brotherhood's future really depends on how long this crackdown lasts. If, for whatever reason, there was a political event and this crackdown ended and many people were released from prison, it could probably resurrect itself pretty quickly.
The Muslim Brotherhood has been through crackdowns
it has been through
before in its century-long
history. But the
history.
longer a crackdown lasts, the harder it is to resurrect. And I'm reminded of Khair al-Shatir's speech in April 2011. He called it the Nata speech. It was about the Renaissance Project, where he said that after the crackdown under Nasser, when Sadat started releasing Muslim brothers from prison in the early and mid-1970s, it took the Brotherhood about 15 years to rebuild the organization. And that was after about 20 years of a crackdown. So the question again is, how long does the current crackdown last? If it's another couple years, you could have the Brotherhood back relatively quickly. If we're talking decades, this will take a long time to rebuild. But because the Brotherhood's in exile, because the Brotherhood has organizations in 70 countries by its own claims, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, because it's not just an organization but an ideology, it will live on in some form, and it will continue to shape Islamism. And it will shape it, by the way, in ways that are very bigoted and very intolerant. And I think when we think about what happened in Egypt, we have to think about what Egypt might look like had the Brotherhood remained in power. And just to sort of touch on that briefly, on June 15th, 2013, Mohammed Morsi hosted a conference in Cairo Stadium with jihadis, calling on Egyptians, the jihadis were calling on Egyptians to join the jihad in Syria. Exactly. Had the Brotherhood managed to stay in power 3 years later, I think Egypt and the region more broadly would look very differently. You would have had many thousands more join the jihad in Syria and then come back to Egypt. That has stopped. And when we talk about the Brotherhood and we talk about its impact, I think it's important to remember that this is an organization that, while it's not jihadi itself, is much closer to jihadis than it is to non-Islamists. And that was really what it demonstrated, I think, to the world and to the West during its time in power, that it could be a serious danger, not because of what it specifically believes, but the way it relates to other Islamist movements.
And that was kind of evident, as you say, in some of the people they brought in during that 1 year.
Absolutely.
I want to take advantage of you being here. It is the beginning of 2017. And I want to just to end with a broad and not a small question, but sort of what do you see as you follow Egyptian politics other than the Muslim Brotherhood? There's a lot of challenges in Egypt today. What would you point to as key things to look for in Egypt 2017? What are sort of your top three?
Look,
politics, economics, security.
The most important thing right now in Egypt is the economy. Because of the devaluation of the Egyptian pound, the floating of the Egyptian pound in early November 2016, which was a really smart move, probably a move that was a painful one, but a necessary one, probably one that was taken too late. Macroeconomically, I mean, a smart move, but a very painful one, a move that immediately cost Egyptians about 40% of their wealth. And with the continued decline of the pound, much more than that, every Egyptian is feeling that. It has, obviously hurt this country's ability to import food. It's created higher prices. Because exports are more competitive, it's meant that there's a shorter supply of especially high quality domestically grown produce. So I think that this is going to be a story that just continues to really affect Egyptians. The fallout of the 2011 to 2013 period is that many Egyptians have sort of stepped back from politics. They feel and I don't want to overgeneralize here, but there is a sentiment there that politics didn't really get them anything. So when you talk with Egyptians about something like, let's say, the NGO law or the media or some of the repression that we talk about a lot in Washington, it doesn't really resonate with them. But what resonates with them very clearly is less foot traffic in their stores, higher prices when they're buying food for their family. And you could sense, I sensed when I was there earlier in December, that it had taken a toll on Sisi's popularity. How much? Hard to measure, but at some point, the economic pain could become political pain. But to touch on the politics, there is no alternative right now in Egypt to Sisi, and that is in part by design. That's a result of the repression, but it's also a result of the fact that at the end of the day, many of those that surround him supported the ouster of Morsi and are in the exact same fight against the Brotherhood that he is, and are therefore attached to him for that reason. So I don't anticipate political change in the near term, but the tougher the economy is, I think the more people will look for an outlet, and that makes something that frankly we can't predict the spark for it, but that makes it always possible.
Well, thank you, Eric. This has been a very interesting discussion. Thanks for making the time to join us here and talk about the Muslim Brotherhood and about Egypt in general. Get the book, read the book, more details in there. And this has been MEI's Vantage Point here at DuPont Circle in Washington. Thanks for following us.